McClellan failed to exploit an opening to destroy Lee's army and shorten the war, leading Lincoln to remove him as general-in-chief in the Union Army. Nevertheless, Antietam offered good enough news to allow Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So this guy, not the best general, George McClellan there. So he was a Democratic nominee for president in the 1864 election, but Lincoln won. Robert E. Lee served as an aide to Winfield Scott during the Mexican-American War, and he gained his military intelligence there. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was stopped by Lee. He commanded the mixed force of militia and soldiers that suppressed his attempted slave uprising. However, his legacy would obviously be defined by betraying the U.S. and taking command of the Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. The Second Battle of Bull Run was also a Confederate victory, which created opening for Robert E. Lee's campaign on Maryland. So this is, again, a big kind of history of the battles of the South here and in the Civil War. Ambrose Burnside was the next general that Lincoln selected to lead the Union Army. In turn, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, he was replaced by Joseph Hooker. He was known for his distinctive facial hair, which literally provided the name for sideburns. His facial hair, and him having the name Ambrose Burnside, was pretty much provided the name for sideburns, believe it or not. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a Civil War battle fought between 11th of December to the 15th of December in 1862. Was a lopsided Confederate victory. Union forces suffering 3-1 casualties. Lincoln removed General Burnside as a result, replacing him with Joseph Hooker. Ulysses S. Grant was the leader. Finally, they got a good general there. During the Civil War, he led Union forces in the West, winning famous victories at Shiloh and Vicksburg. He was eventually placed in command of the whole U.S. Army in 1864, where he fought several engagements with Robert E. Lee. He supervised Reconstruction efforts and prosecuted efforts against the KKK. He served 2 terms as president with decidedly mixed results, with a very corrupt administration. So the Battle of Gettysburg was arguably the most significant battle in the Civil War. 50,000 plus men died there. It was the final major Confederate push into the North, and Lee's defeat ended any hope of Britain or France recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. General Meade's failure to chase and destroy Lee's retreating army lengthened the war, unfortunately. The Gettysburg Address was a brief and poignant address delivered by Abraham Lincoln, pretty much making his case for the end of the war and the idea that all men are created equal, and that's the way our founding fathers meant it to be. So William Sherman was a Union general. Sherman's army captured and destroyed Atlanta in September of 1864. Sherman then marched to South Carolina, ordered troops to burn and destroy fields, homes, and cities as they marched through Georgia. His goal was to inflict misery on Southerners so they would be compelled to surrender. This was the total war, the first total war with citizens as targets. It was quite a move. It was really the first of its kind to be used in the Civil War. It was a major event, but finally the war ended at the Appomattox Courthouse, the site of the former surrounded by General Lee and Confederate Army, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, 2 Union forces led by General Grant. The act triggered a series of other Confederate forces surrendering, finally ending the Civil War, which took place in 1865. The end of slavery brought about the Confiscation Acts, which were laws passed by the early in the Civil War that allowed the Union troops to seize enemy property that could be used in an act of war. Slaves fit under the loose definition of property and thus could be confiscated. The second of these acts freed slaves in any territory that was currently in rebellion against the Union. These were the first steps in the Emancipation. Emancipation was an executive order Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order that freed slaves in any areas that were in rebellion. Slavery in the border states was still legal. Despite the limitations, the proclamation did much to bolster the morale of Union troops and supporters at home. However, some Unionists felt betrayed, believing they'd been duped into fighting a war for emancipation instead of merely the Union's preservation. they're like, wait, we got to worry about slaves now too? I did not sign on for this. That's pretty much what they're saying. The proclamation also served to dissuade Britain and France from recognizing Confederacy as it would reframe the moral context for the war in opposition to slavery. Abolitionism was popular with the voters in Britain and France. So that does make them look a little bit better. 13th Amendment banned slavery and the involuntary servitude of any kind and functionally repealed the Three-Fifths Clause, passed in early 1865 and ratified later that year. The amendment was one of Lincoln's last major achievements prior to his assassination. John Wilkes Booth was a famous actor in his own lifetime. Booth's best remembered, obviously, for orchestrating the assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865 at Ford's Theater. Booth and his co-conspirators had tried on multiple occasions to assassinate Lincoln. In fact, the other key cabinet figures were supposed to be killed simultaneously with Lincoln, but those plots failed for varying reasons, including one guy just being too afraid and sitting at the bar. So here are some consequences of the Civil War. The writ of habeas corpus. During the Civil War, Lincoln exercises executive power to limit Americans' civil rights and liberties to protect the Union. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which meant that the federal government could hold an individual in jail with no charges levied against him or her. For many alleged traitors, this meant long jail terms with no charges ever filed. Lincoln intended for the suspension to be temporary, and the constitutional right would be restored after the war was over. When the Taney Court ruled his actions illegal, Lincoln just ignored this. The second time a president has done that. A law that provided a settler with 160 acres of land if he promised to live on it and work it for at least 5 years was made in 1862, called the Homestead Act. About 500,000 families took advantage of this act, which, while many more brought land from private purveyors. Unfortunately, the parcels of land on the Great Plains were difficult to farm, which led to a lot of them actually ending up leaving. Let's talk about Reconstruction. It was a period from 1865 to 1877 of rebuilding and reforming the South following the Civil War. It was considered a failure as many African Americans were left destitute and disenfranchised for another century. Andrew Johnson was the president starting off during this war. It was only one of 3 presidents to be impeached, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, the other 2. He was not convicted. He took office after Lincoln's assassination. A Democrat who had run with Republican Lincoln. He was disliked by Congress, especially for his mild terms for Reconstruction and disinterest in protecting newly freed slaves. He was definitely more of a Southern sympathizer, and the radical Republicans passing the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 and the 14th Amendment would not have been done without Johnson's presidency. This led to the 10% Plan, also known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Lincoln proposed the plan in 1863 as a way to bring the southern states back under the wing of the federal government. The plan reestablished state governments and required at least 10% of the state's voters to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States and Constitution. Lincoln was also prepared to grant complete pardons to any former Confederate, but required an oath of allegiance and agreement to eliminate slavery. The Wade-Davis bill was part of this. It passed both houses in 1864 in response to Lincoln's 10% plan. It required that 50% of southern state voters take the loyalty oath. This was kind of a little bit more specific, shall we say. It required 50% of southern states voters to take the loyalty oath and allowed only those citizens who had not been active members or supporters of the Confederacy to approve of the new state constitutions. By exercising executive power, Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill by refusing to sign it. So this was pretty much the requirements in this bill were pretty much impossible and never going to be met. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a government program created in 1865 to help manage and assist newly emancipated slaves. The Bureau provided assistance in the form of food, shelter, and medical attention to African Americans. Eventually, the Bureau would establish schools across the South to help educate large numbers of former slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau struggled as Congress refused to increase its funding, which expired in 1872. The Black Codes were laws passed by the Southern legislature in response to the legal emancipation of slaves. These codes restricted the action, movements, and freedoms of African Americans. Under these codes, African Americans could not own land, so they were tied instead to small plots leased from a landowner, pretty much slavery in name. Only the black codes also did the same thing, pretty much. Sharecroppers would lease land and borrow supplies to till their plots while giving a significant portion of their harvest to the landowner as payment for the loan. This is a very exploitative system and ensured farmers were never able to harvest enough to pay their landlord and feed their families. Generations of African Americans were made tied to their plot of land until the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. The Civil Rights Bill of 1866, however, was designed to end the black codes by giving African Americans full citizenship. As expected, Johnson vetoed the bill and Congress overturned his veto, the first time in American history that has happened. Many Republicans were concerned that a future return of a Democratic majority might mean the end of the bill they'd worked so hard to pass. Therefore, they needed a more permanent solution in the form of the 14th Amendment, which was a real response to the Reconstruction efforts of President Johnson. Proposed in 1866 and ratified in 1868, it protected the rights of all U.S. citizens, granted all African Americans full citizenship and civil rights, pretty much the establishing the concept of birthright citizenship. Furthermore, disallowed former Confederate officers from holding state or federal office. It would decrease the proportional representation of any state that had denied suffrage to any able citizen. Military Reconstruction Act was passed in 1867 by a radical Republican Congress. It placed the South under martial law, dividing the South into 5 districts that would be governed by a Union general in each. The act further tightened the readmission of requirements from former Confederate states by requiring petitioning states to ratify the 14th Amendment for universal manhood suffrage. That's how they got that kind of passed there. The act was a response to the leniency displayed by Johnson toward the Confederacy. The Tenure of Office Act was pretty much a trap, really, for Johnson to be impeached. It disallowed the president, Andrew Johnson, from discharging a federal appointee without the Senate's consent. With the act, Republicans in Congress attempted to protect their positions from Johnson. The president chose to ignore this act and refire the Republican Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. The House promptly submitted articles of impeachment to the floor by charging Johnson with 11 counts of high crimes and misdemeanors. Secretary of State, he was at the time, he was a radical Republican, and his firing triggered this impeachment. Thaddeus Stevens was a Republican member of the House, serving until his death in 1868. He was a key radical Republican. He fired by an abolitionist and proponent of civil rights for African Americans. He was at the forefront of pushing a sterner Reconstruction agenda over President Johnson's objections. Charles Sumner was a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, a radical Republican abolitionist. He pushed the protection of civil rights in southern states. He famously was caned on the floor of the Senate by Preston Brooks, a southern pro-slavery senator. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, barring any state from denying a citizen's right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous servitude. However, it did not ban any poll taxes or literary tests, which would be a loophole exploited by whites at the end of the Reconstruction period to suppress more African American votes in a more clever way. Civil Rights Act of 1865 would be the last of the Reconstruction era civil rights reforms, making it a crime for any person to be denied full and equal use of public places such as hotels, restaurants, and theaters. Unfortunately, this act lacked any wording to enforce it, and therefore was ignored by most states, both northern and southern, unfortunately. Scalawags was a term coined by Southern Democrats, pretty much meaning a derogatory term for any Southern Republicans that meant they were pirates and sought to steal from state governments and line their own pockets when they came down during the Reconstruction period. It's pretty much the same thing as carpetbaggers. During this time, South was occupied during some periods militarily. They were very upset, and they created the KKK. It was an underground society of whites who would ruthlessly and successfully use terrorist tactics to frighten both white and black Republicans in the South. While quashed by the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871, the organization survived and resurfaced, spreading through the country in later years. Still around in much less of a force today. The Force Acts, they were passed in 1870 and 1871, authorizing the federal use of federal troops to quell violence and enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. While these acts were moderately successful